Hello once again. In this video we'll be introducing the combination of chapters 12 and 13, which is going to be focusing on social behavior, sociality, and altruism, and this will take us through the end of the semester. So the goal for today is to just introduce and do the first 8 or so slides to introduce the topic and get our discussion going. Here's how I've outlined the chapter, and I'm sort of doing air quotes with chapter here, in that we're going to be doing 2 chapters more or less simultaneously, and we'll kind of jump back and forth. I'm actually going to start with a lot of the topics that are in chapter 13, and then kind of go back to chapter 12. But I'm actually a little bit excited about this. I think this is going to work really well, and in a way I kind of prefer the presentation here to how it's actually presented in your textbook. So we'll just talk about costs and benefits of social behavior, because that's going to be our focal topic. And we'll talk specifically about some of the benefits related to a form of cooperative or of social behavior that involves cooperation. So this is where you have mutual benefit, or sometimes it's postponed benefits or postponed cooperation. And then there's another form of this called reciprocity. And so we'll discuss all these topics. I'm planning to get through most of these in this video lecture. And then when we get back, we'll talk about, specifically, I think we'll start on next Tuesday talking about reciprocity, but then we'll also talk about altruism and group selection. Kin selection is a really important concept that we'll spend some time on. And then I have a case study to kind of round out the discussion on Belding's ground squirrels. And I think that'll make for a good way to cover this topic. The homework will then extend some of the concepts that we're doing in lecture. So there are specific examples talking about lemmings and buntings and manakins and kingfishers and mole rats, and I think it's a nice set of questions that we'll be able to discuss next Thursday, and I think that will do a good job of finishing off the semester for us and finishing off this topic. So I know we're watching a video, but I would like you to kind of pause the video after I ask you this question. So why would one opt to live in a social group? And I think if we're going to identify group living organisms like these beekeepers that are shown in this picture, we need to figure out what are the costs and what are the benefits to living in this kind of a social group. So actually my suggestion is I'd like you to pause the video and then take a minute or two and try to jot down 2 or 3 costs and 2 or 3 benefits that could be associated with living in a social group. And some of that could be going back to discussions that we had earlier in the semester. So I'll pause here for a moment and allow you to pause the video. Okay, so you can sort of think about what are some of the costs and what are some of the benefits that you've written down. Here are a couple that I think we have talked about, but I wanted to cover them explicitly because there are definitely costs associated with living in social groups. This is an example that I think I may have mentioned this in passing when we were talking about group living from an anti-predator defense standpoint earlier in the semester, but parasites and disease can be a really major problem when you're living in a social group. The easiest way to contract a disease is to be interacting and living closely with members of your own species, because a bug that can effectively attack them or attack other individuals within your social group can probably also attack you. And so as a result of that, those animals that do live in social groups tend to encounter pretty substantial problems associated with parasites and other disease. This was a classic study that was done on cliff swallows, where the difference between these swallows are swallow chicks. They were actually hatched on exactly the same day. But this individual lived in a nest that was fumigated. And so as a result, all of the various little swallow bugs, and they're literally called swallow bugs, but they're a lot like bed bugs. They're little blood-sucking parasites, literally. They were all killed using this fumigation. And you can see the result is that this guy is able to develop much, much, much faster than was the control individual that was not subjected to these kinds of fumigations. And of course, these are just 2 examples, but this is a replicated study. And I think it does a really striking job of explaining how important parasites and disease can be in terms of one's survival and growth rates and ability to thrive within an environment. There are other costs to group living that we've discussed, and we kind of discussed them in reverse. We were talking about what are some of the benefits of dispersal, but the benefits of dispersal are kind of the costs of staying behind. So if you do stay behind and you live in a large group, you're going to have more competition for food because the individuals you're living with eat the same things that you do. You may have competition for mates. I don't even have competition for shelter on here, but that certainly could be a problem. And you have increased likelihood of inbreeding. So if you don't disperse, if you stay with your group, you're going to be living around a lot of relatives, and that has the potential for you to then be inbreeding. And those individuals that do inbreed tend to suffer from exposing deleterious alleles at a much higher rate than they would be if they were outbred. So given that there are all these costs to social living, there must then be benefits. And we have discussed some of the benefits before for sure. So for example, one of the main examples we've discussed are the anti-predator benefits in terms of dilution effect and selfish herd and increased vigilance and all the things that one gains from being part of a group in terms of avoiding predators. And so that certainly is an important benefit. In this chapter, what we're actually going to be focusing on is the benefits that individuals can gain in terms of social benefits, so things that they're gaining as being part of a social group. And to start investigating what are the sort of consequences of interacting in a social setting, your book kind of presents this grid, and this works a little bit like a Punnett square. So here you've got if you have some kind of a behavior, and we could, the behavior is sort of vague at this point, we could shape it in different ways. What happens when the donor, the person or animal that is doing the behavior, benefits, and what happens when they're paying some sort of a cost? Similarly, if there's a recipient, what happens when the recipient is benefiting, and what happens when they're suffering some kind of a cost. So each of these squares represents an intersection between the donor benefiting or paying a cost and the recipient benefiting or paying some sort of negative consequence. So if you have a situation where whoever initiates the behavior toward the other individual, if they're benefiting, so this is, you see the black pluses here are indicating that the donor is benefiting and the recipient is also benefiting, we consider this to be a mutual benefit, which you could sometimes refer to as a mutualism. Whoops. And so this would be a situation where both individuals that are part of this behavior are benefiting, both the doer and the doee, if you will, of the social interaction. You could also have a situation where the donor is actually suffering some sort of a cost. They're paying out some sort of a cost, but it's for the benefit of a recipient. And this is sometimes referred to as altruism. And so altruism would be where a pure altruism would be where you're paying some kind of cost, you're not benefiting from a behavior that you're doing, but someone else is benefiting from that behavior. And both of these are considered to be examples of cooperation in general, a sort of big sense cooperation, which would be cases where you've got two individuals and the recipient is benefiting from the behavior that you are doing to them. You could also have situations where the donor is benefiting, the doee, might be a better way to say this than the donor, but the doer is benefiting, and the recipient of this social interaction is actually suffering. And so this would be an example of some sort of selfishness. So, if an individual has found a piece of fruit and another individual walks up to that first individual and takes the fruit from them, that means the doer, the donor, in this case, is actually the one that grabbed the fruit. They're benefiting from that selfish behavior, whereas the recipient is suffering negatively from that. They've lost their resource. And then in theory, you could also have cases of spite, which is where the doer is suffering some sort of negative consequence, and it's called spite because they're paying some sort of negative consequence just to have the other person suffer, or the other individual within the group suffer. We actually don't see this kind of thing very often in nature. I'm not saying it never happens, but it isn't something that we would expect to happen very often, at least in terms of a behavior that would be shaped by selection, because it's not benefiting the doer at all, and it's certainly not benefiting the recipient at all to do that. Okay, so with that framework in mind, what we're actually going to focus on in this chapter primarily are examples of cooperation. So we'll start by talking about cases where there's a mutual benefit, so the doer and the recipient both benefit from the behavior. May not be immediate benefit, but they do both benefit from the behavior. And then we'll talk about cases later in the chapter, when we get back from Thanksgiving break, that are more about altruism. And so these are cases where there's an apparent cost that's paid by the donor, and yet the recipient seems to be benefiting. And so the big question is, well, why is selection causing the donor to behave in that manner? Why would you ever behave in a manner that would be a negative cost to one's own fitness? Okay, so with that kind of introduction, we'll talk a bit now about examples of mutual benefit. So mutual benefits, we see many examples of these kinds of things when we're looking at animals that live in social groups. So a classic thing that, I grew up watching Wild America and other kinds of nature shows on TV, and a classic example are the hunting behaviors of lionesses, which are just incredibly good hunters. Not only are they good hunters, but they're incredibly good at using teamwork, where one lioness will drive a wildebeest, in this case it's a wildebeest calf, into another, and then into another. They kind of wear it down, they get it tired, and then they eventually drive it into an ambush set by other lionesses, and then all of them get to feed upon that initial wildebeest. So if you are a lioness that drives wildebeest into an ambush set by other lionesses, then the other lionesses are certainly benefiting. These would be the recipients of that behavior that you just did. They're benefiting because they get to eat. But then you also get a share of the meat, and so you also benefit from this process. And if everybody plays their role, then everybody's going to get to feed, and this can be a mutually beneficial kind of an arrangement. So we would call this a mutual benefit situation, or I'm okay with you calling it a mutualism. Sometimes people get pretty picky about definitions of that, but this is a situation where both individuals, or both the donor and the recipient of the behavior, is getting a positive sort of an benefit from that particular interaction. Now, in some cases, the benefits that you get may be more postponed, so you may not immediately benefit from a behavior, but by participating in the behavior, you may get subsequent benefits that kind of happen down the road. An example of this kind of behavior occurs with these paper wasps. So in Polistes dominilis, what we have foundress queens that create a colony, and so this is basically their nest, and they will lay eggs within the nest. This is where their larvae will hatch, and primarily the individual that gets to lay the eggs usually is whoever is the dominant female, the queen of this particular colony. However, she will often have a number of helpers. In some cases, these helpers are relatives. I think in some cases they're actually not relatives. But the helpers spend most of their time basically caring for the young of the queen and helping in other ways, maybe to help expand the nest cavity. But they do get some minor amount of opportunity at times in order to lay eggs kind of on the sly. So the foundress, most of the time, the eggs that are laid in these cells will be of the foundress queen, but occasionally she does seem to permit her subordinates to lay eggs on the sly on occasion. And so that does allow the subordinates, by helping and being part of this small group, this small family of paper wasps, they can still get some reproductive success out of this deal. Furthermore, so there is sort of a best of a bad situation, I guess. If you are a subordinate female, you don't have your own nest. Rather than going and trying to found it alone, subordinates, by laying some eggs on the side, can still gain a modicum of reproductive success. And that's what's shown in this figure. So a solitary foundress, if an individual was to leave that nest and go try to create her own, their average per capita number of pupae, so basically this is an indication of their direct reproductive success, the number of pupa they're able to raise, is a pretty low number. I mean, it's something around about 0.025 or so, it looks like to me, maybe 0.02. Whereas subordinates that are part of a larger nest with larger group size that get to have a little bit of egg laying, they're shown in the blue dots here. And especially once group size gets to be up around 9, 10, 11, once you get into that range, there's enough opportunity to lay eggs on the side that you are able to often outcompete somebody who would just be a sort of solitary foundress. And so that means that it's better to hang around this colony and continue to lay eggs internally, so that you'll get a little bit of reproductive success, even though the majority of pupae that are being reared out of this small nest are those of the foundress queen. The reason I should point out that the solitary foundresses often do so poorly is it's very difficult to found a nest. And predation is very high, failure rates are very high, and so there's a very good chance that these individuals aren't going to produce any offspring at all. Of course, if they are successful and they do found a colony, that colony can then have a very large number of pupae, and so you'll have huge variance around this dot. This is an average, probably a median, but some individuals, most individuals in fact, will have a 0, but there'll be some individuals that will be off the charts high if they happen to be successful in founding a successful colony that attracts other helper wasps. There's another thing though that's shown in this figure, and this is maybe the main point I should have been making this whole time, and that is that another thing will happen in that not only do subordinates get the opportunity to lay some eggs on the side while they are helping, but they also will sometimes inherit a nest after a foundress queen passes away and dies or disappears. So if a foundress queen dies and disappears and you inherit the nest and become the dominant female at that nest, you can sort of see what happens. That's what's shown with these brown dots. Your ability, your mean per capita number of pupae, the number of offspring that you're able to produce, is massively higher. And so in addition to getting a small benefit just by helping, by being able to lay some of your own eggs, you get a postponed benefit, which is shown up here, by sometimes getting to inherit that nest from the dominant female. And at that point, that's when your real payout to all that help you've been putting in all that time comes into play. So what this means is, I guess, twofold. One is that you're sort of making the best of a bad situation. The other is that really this is a nice example of a mutual benefit situation, right? So these subordinates are helping the foundress queen, but they're kind of doing it in anticipation that there's a chance that they'll later inherit that nest. And if they do inherit that nest, that's when they reap the benefits of all of their helping that they've done prior to that point. So we would call this, it's cooperation, it's a mutualism, but it's a postponed cooperation because most of the benefits that you get happen later. They don't immediately get paid back, like in the case of the lioness where you drive a wildebeest into your den mate's group. At that point then everybody gets to feed simultaneously and you immediately benefit from that behavior. This is more of a postponed behavior. Now so that's the first sort of two examples. There's another sort of situation here, and I'm just going to kind of set this up without really getting into, I don't want to get to the answer of it, but this is where we will start on Tuesday, where we do sometimes run into behaviors that are apparently altruistic. So this means that there's an apparent act that is done where the doer is paying some kind of a cost, and it could be a minor cost, but it could be energy or time, it could be a major cost. So what happens when a cost is being paid by the doer for the benefit of the recipient? So in this case, what they're showing is here's a male, here's another individual that's part of that male's same troop. These are baboons, and you can see that this the browner individual here is grooming this individual. He's basically going through his hair, grabbing up any bugs that are in the hair, ticks, other kinds of things, and in that way, helping this guy to stay clean and get rid of parasites. So this is a beneficial behavior for him. These are high Madras baboons. This is a beneficial behavior for him, but it's not really apparently benefiting this individual, at least not in an immediate sense. So what exactly is going on here? So that's what we'll be talking about on Tuesday, is what kind of benefit, or is there a benefit that this individual who's paying an apparent cost at this moment, is it going to benefit from this situation in some other way, or is it going to benefit from it later on? All right. That's all I'm going to do for this chapter. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you after Thanksgiving break. I hope you have a wonderful break.